Poor girl cries after being excluded from an award ceremony, until the millionaire whispers, "You've won something bigger." And what he hands her, no one believes. The five-star hotel's ballroom erupted in applause, lights, and flashes when the winner was announced. But in the left corner, sitting alone in a simple borrowed dress with teary eyes, sat Ellie, the only finalist not called to the stage. The other girls laughed at her. "You're only here because they messed up the form." One of them even purposely spilled champagne on her hand-me-down purse. The host completely ignored her name, as if she were invisible. The embarrassment was brutal. The cameras were averted. She tried to smile, but her eyes were trembling. As everyone filed out for the cocktail hour reserved for the worthy, a firm hand touched her shoulder. It was the evening's millionaire host, Mason Carter. He leaned over and whispered in her ear, "You didn't win the trophy, but you won something bigger." Everyone stopped. He then placed something in her closed hand. What Ellie held made the entire room fall silent, and suddenly the laughter stopped. In Ellie's palm was a small golden key and a card with a handwritten address. The camera filmed discreetly. The media tried to ignore it, but soon the news leaked. That address led to a historic building in Manhattan, and not just any building. It was the abandoned headquarters of the former Carter Foundation, a billion-dollar organization frozen after a scandal. The next morning, the building's facade displayed a banner, "Reopening under new management, Eleanor James." The corporate world trembled. Websites and newspapers searched for explanations. Who was this girl in the borrowed dress? How could a simple gesture from a tycoon change the entire power structure of the city? And most of all, why would Mason Carter, known for being cold, arrogant, and calculating, hand over to a stranger something that could destroy or save his empire? Before continuing, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel and like this video, so you can continue receiving our real stories. Thank you very much. A light rain was beginning to fall over Manhattan as the first luxury cars arrived at Grand Astoria Hall, one of New York's most exclusive ballrooms. The facade's lights shimmered gold and blue, reflecting off the black umbrellas held by uniformed security guards. It was the night of the Heart of Philanthropy Award ceremony, an annual award for young social leaders who had supposedly made an impact with innovative charitable projects. But in reality, the event more closely resembled an elite parade disguised as altruism. While daughters of CEOs and millionaire influencers posed on the red carpet in custom-made dresses by European designers, a shy out-of-place figure stepped out of the taxi, its windows jammed shut. Ellie held the hem of her pale blue dress that barely covered her ankles. The fabric was wrinkled. It had been borrowed from a colleague at the city library where she was interning. She wore no heels or jewelry, her hair tied in a simple bun, and her clean, makeup-free face drew attention not because of her beauty, but because she clashed with the forced brightness of the surroundings. One of the photographers even lowered his camera as she passed. No one recognized her. She entered the lobby timidly, trying to figure out if she really belonged there. One of the receptionists hesitated before confirming her name. On the list. "Oh, Eleanor James. Are you one of the finalists?" The other murmured, "She must have been a political appointee. It happens." Ellie smiled awkwardly and received her name tag. She walked alone to table number 14, the only one without floral arrangements. With each step, her presence seemed to generate small whispers. The other finalists were clustered at prime tables in front of the stage. They laughed among themselves, took selfies, and commented that their campaigns had been managed by marketing agencies. Ellie, on the other hand, had started a book club for orphaned children and elderly people with Alzheimer's in a marginalized neighborhood. No sponsors, no advisors, no glamour. The event's host, Mason Carter, watched from his reserved upstairs box. At 37, he was one of the most feared and admired billionaires on the East Coast. Owner of companies ranging from technology to insurance, Carter was known for his ruthless intelligence and cold-blooded business dealings. No one understood why he had chosen to be the personal sponsor of that year's event. They said he was trying to clean up his image after a scandal involving funding cuts to a children's health non-profit. From his box, his eyes fell on Ellie for a moment. He didn't react. He just watched. The start of the ceremony brought long speeches and forced self-celebrations. The most popular finalists were called one by one to the stage, receiving flowers and trophies. Ellie remained seated. Some girls laughed quietly at her. "Did you see her shoes? They look like they were bought at the corner thrift store." "Who nominated her again?" "Oh, it was the principal of a public school. That explains it." Ellie lowered her eyes to the floor, but something inside her didn't waver, as if she were accustomed to this feeling, as if silence were her armor. From above, Mason Carter continued to watch, and in that split second, when Ellie raised her eyes and gazed at the stage without rancor, only with a restrained gleam of dignity in her eyes, something made him frown slightly, as if an ancient echo within him had been awakened, as if that solitary figure in that hall full of opulence and falsehood concealed a truth he himself had been trying to bury for years. The ceremony continued, but for him everything had stopped for a moment. In Ellie's childhood, there were no birthday cakes or framed photos. Her world was a room too small for 3 siblings and a mother who could barely hide the scars on her body. Her father, absent in life and presence, disappeared when she was 7, first to the streets, then to addiction, and finally to a forgotten cell somewhere in South Texas. The little Ellie knew of love came from her maternal grandmother, a woman with calloused hands who would repeat as she braided her granddaughter's hair, "People who shine too brightly on the outside are sometimes fading inside, girl, but those who learn to turn on the light in the dark, they never go out." When her grandmother died, Ellie was 11 years old and had to leave her small wooden house and move with her mother to a temporary shelter. There she learned to share her bed, fear, and silence with other children who carried trauma in their eyes. She grew up without wanting to attract attention, always silent with her hands in her pockets and her eyes alert. Over time she developed a rare skill, listening, not just words, but emotions, and this sensitivity allowed her to capture pains that no one spoke aloud. At 16, she got her first scholarship to an excellent public school in Austin. "I drove 2 hours by bus to get there, but I never missed a class. I read the borrowed books like someone chewing bread after 2 days of hunger. I read because, between pages, the characters always had a chance to start over." By 18, Ellie had read over 300 classic novels, all annotated in an old notebook with the handwritten cover, "Heart is Library." It was during this time that she began visiting a nursing home near the shelter, at first just to volunteer. Later, because she began to fall in love with the stories, elderly people with Alzheimer's called her daughter, wife, nurse. She responded with the same affection to them all. One day, one of them, Mr. Dawson, made her promise, "You will turn this into a real home, and you will call it a living library." Ellie smiled, and she didn't forget. During college, also earned through merit, sweat, and late nights, she created a simple community project, bringing together orphaned children and forgotten elderly people in weekly reading sessions. She called the project Invisible Bridges. It began with 3 children and 2 elderly people. It ended the semester with 32 participants and a waiting list. But there was no funding. There was no support. The project continued only thanks to small donations from local booksellers, a few professors, and her own intern salary. When the announcement for the Heart of Philanthropy Award came out, Ellie almost didn't apply. The form asked for a corporate video, a portfolio, and letters of recommendation. She only had 1 typed page and a shaky video recorded by one of the project's students, showing a girl reading a poem on the lap of a 92-year-old woman. The application was submitted on the last day without much expectation. 2 months later, an email appeared in her inbox. "Congratulations, Eleanor James. You're one of the finalists selected for the ceremony in New York." She thought it was a scam. She confirmed it 5 times before believing it. There was no way she could afford the trip. But a professor at the university center started an anonymous fundraiser. A taxi driver friend drove her to the airport, and the owner of the local thrift store lent her the blue dress, saying, "It's simple, but go with faith, you're the one who shines." Ellie arrived in the city with a small suitcase, a heavy heart, and a note tucked into her shoe. It doesn't matter if no one applauds, you've already won. She didn't want fame or status. She wanted visibility for the project. She wanted books for little ones. And deep down, she wanted someone to notice that what she did had value, even if it didn't shine in the spotlight. The bet was made in the finalists' dressing room, hours before the ceremony. Amid the sound of hairdryers, the clinking of champagne glasses, and forced laughter, a malicious question emerged that sounded more like venom disguised as a joke. How long do you think the weirdo in the blue dress will last before leaving? One of the girls, the daughter of an oil tycoon, laughed out loud and replied, "She shouldn't even be here. That's resume charity. I bet you $500 she'll quit before the third trophy is handed out." The others burst out laughing. "$500? I'll make it $300. I bet she'll cry in the hallway." The deal was sealed. What's more, one of the finalists, Juliette Monroe, a media darling with millions of followers, decided to speed up the game. She had her makeup artist hand Ellie a fake note just before she entered. "Production regrets to inform you that your name has been removed from the list of finalists. Please leave discreetly after the reception." Ellie read the note with trembling hands, her face trying not to give in to embarrassment. But instead of leaving, she put the note in her purse and went in anyway. Seeing her arrive, the girls looked at each other in surprise. "Is she still here?" one murmured. "Maybe she can't read English," whispered another, eliciting muffled giggles. The night had barely begun, and Ellie was already the target of sidelong glances, whispers, and small, nasty gestures, like the waiter who was instructed to ignore her table, or the collective toast they all made while staring at her, without including her. But the height of cruelty came when the live broadcast began. The organizers, pressured by sponsors, had been ordered to prioritize cameras over recognizable faces. Ellie's desk was purposefully placed behind a column. On the schedule, her name didn't even appear in the speaking order. And on the main presenter's electronic device, there was a note: "Avoid mentioning candidate Eleanor James, in case any doubts arise about her eligibility." During the cocktail reception, Juliet approached with a plastic smile and said loud enough for others to hear, "Hi, Ellie, right? I really admire your courage to come even with so little." The group around her laughed. Ellie simply replied, "Thank you. Courage usually comes when you have no other choice." The sentence silenced the laughter for a second. But soon another girl chimed in. "What a beautiful sentence. Too bad there's no room for people like you on this stage." The dirty game was underway, and with every passing minute Ellie was tested, pressured, provoked. But she remained there, sitting, watching, her posture straight, and her eyes steady. She didn't flinch. She didn't defend herself. She simply was. Present, as if each humiliation was absorbed with the serenity of someone who already knew the pain inside. Backstage, some staff members were saying to each other, "This girl is different. I don't know what's wrong with her, but she's not typical." And one of the cameras, which was supposed to film only the famous finalists, discreetly shifted and captured Ellie helping a cleaning lady who had dropped a tray of glasses. The image, at the time, didn't seem relevant, but it would become historic hours later. The first contact between Ellie and Mason Carter happened almost imperceptibly. It was late afternoon, shortly before the ceremony, when she got lost in the inner corridors of Grand Astoria Hall, searching for a bathroom that wasn't crowded with girls giggling loudly and touching up their lipstick. She went through a side door, unaware that it led to restricted access to the executive backstage area. She walked in silence, admiring the portraits of past founders and framed quotes about legacy and purpose. That's when she heard firm footsteps and a voice on the phone. "I don't care if it upsets the investors. If this foundation doesn't serve to truly change lives, then we're just pretending to be a charity." She turned discreetly and saw a tall man in an impeccable black suit and slightly disheveled dark brown hair walking in the opposite direction. It was Mason. As he hung up the phone, he noticed her presence. They both stopped. She tried to explain. "Sorry. I got lost. I'm just looking for the bathroom." Mason stared at her for 2 seconds too long. not with judgment but with a kind of pent-up curiosity, as if trying to recognize something. "You're the living library girl?" he asked, as if he just wanted to confirm something he already knew. Ellie was surprised. "Yes. How did you—" He cut her off. "I received a dossier of all the finalist projects. Only one of them was handwritten." She looked down, embarrassed. "It's just that I don't have a laptop. Most of the library computers are always crashing, and I thought it would be okay." Mason interrupted her again, without changing his tone. "It wasn't. It was the only one I read all the way through." The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was thick. There was a layer there that neither of them yet understood. Ellie thanked him quietly and was about to turn to leave when he said, "You don't belong here. But that's not a bad thing." She stopped. She looked at him. There was sincerity in her words. No condescension, no pity, just a realization. "Neither do you," she replied almost reflexively. Mason didn't react, but watched as she walked back to the main hallway. When she disappeared from view, he let out a small, almost imperceptible sigh, as if struck by something ancient. He resumed walking, but this time with a different pace, as if the presence of that young woman, fragile in appearance but unbreakable in gaze, had opened a fissure in the marble shield he had worn for years. During the ceremony, even surrounded by counselors and cameras, Mason glanced discreetly at Ellie's table. She didn't see him again that night, but he saw her. She saw every look of contempt they threw at her. He saw every silence imposed on her. He saw the posture she maintained, even when everything around her seemed to want to break her. In his final speech before the trophy presentation, Mason took the microphone. The audience fell silent. He thanked the sponsors and organizers and finally said, "Tonight is about recognizing those who change the world with what they have. But there's something rarer than money or influence, quiet courage, and there are those who have it, even without a spotlight." He didn't look directly at Ellie, but she knew. Something inside her stirred, as if an invisible mirror had been held up between them, and in that reflection they both recognized similar scars. The public humiliation came like a whirlwind disguised as an elegant ceremony. With each name announced, applause echoed, lights flashed, and cameras focused on the finalists, all pre-made up, rehearsed, and above all, connected with the right sponsors. Ellie, seated at her secluded table behind the column, watched each trophy presentation with a mixture of serenity and dismay. She hadn't expected to win, but neither had she imagined being completely erased. When only 2 finalists remained, the host paused for a special thanks. Ellie straightened her posture. Anne took a deep breath. Perhaps it was there at that moment that her name would be announced. Perhaps it was there that the space reserved for those who don't fit the mold, but are valuable nonetheless. And finally, a round of applause for all the volunteers who, even without awards, make a difference in their communities. "Thank you so much." The applause was lukewarm. Ellie swallowed. It wasn't a thank you. It was a gentle push off the stage. A thank you that sounded like, "You can leave." Now, but she stayed. Juliet, the favorite, was called to the stage next as the night's big winner. As she walked up, she gave Ellie a look of cruel victory, as if she knew the bet was won. She held the golden trophy, posed for photos, and taking the microphone said with false emotion, "I dedicate this award to all the girls who, like me, were born with a silver spoon in their mouth, but decided to fight anyway, because having privilege is also a responsibility." The audience applauded. Ellie only closed her eyes for a second. The blow wasn't just against her, it was against the truth. During the post-ceremony cocktail hour, guests scattered throughout the main ballroom. Ellie remained seated, ignored. A few waiters avoided her. One of them, on someone's orders, pretended to trip and spilled white wine on the hem of her dress. He apologized without making eye contact. The laughter echoed again. One of the finalists feigned concern. "Oh, honey, you can try cleaning up in the service bathroom back there, you know. That's where people who don't have access to the VIP area go." But Ellie didn't react. He calmly stood up, grabbed his bag, and headed for the exit. The pain was real, but not new. The world's contempt has always been subtle toward those it doesn't understand. And yet, as she walked in silence, she held her head high. It was at that moment, just inside the door, that a firm, calm voice cut through the room. Eleanor James. Everyone turned. Mason Carter was descending the steps from the host's area. He crossed the room with slow steps, as if time had slowed down. He stopped beside her and said simply, "You didn't win the trophy, but you won something greater." His hand extended a small box. Inside were a golden key and a card with an address. The flashes went off. The smiles froze. The voices fell silent. Ellie, in a dirty dress and teary eyes, now held something no one could understand, but everyone sensed. The tables had turned. Ellie didn't need to ask. She knew what that key meant, not literally. The address on the card was unknown, the box uninstructed, the gesture shrouded in mystery. But deep down, she understood. This was the end of the humiliation, and the beginning of something that could never be erased. The next morning, the city was still waking in a light fog when she took the subway to the address written firmly on the card, 917 Fifth Avenue, Manhattan. It was an imposing building with white columns and arched windows, the former site of the Carter Foundation, a symbol of corporate philanthropy that had closed its doors after scandals involving embezzlement and data manipulation. It had been empty for 3 years, abandoned, but now on its facade, a new banner hung with thick ropes still unstretched. New direction, new soul. And beside the door, where a gold plaque with the foundation's name had once stood, a new sign had been hastily installed. Living Library, Headquarters. Ellie entered, key in hand. The interior was covered in dust and echoes of the past. The walls, once cold, held forgotten files. She walked slowly, touching the edges of the tables, feeling the energy of something about to be reborn. In the center of the room, on a long counter, sat a single blue folder with her name on it. Inside, a contract signed by Mason Carter transferred the building's use, indefinitely, to the Invisible Bridges project. There was also a handwritten letter. "You were the only one who reminded me why this started. Transform, and silence the noisy with the beauty of the invisible." That afternoon, social media exploded. Photos of the moment Mason handed the box to Ellie had leaked. Videos of the ceremony circulated with headlines like, "Who is the mysterious girl who won over billionaire Carter?" or "Stained dress, steady gaze, and an empire in hand." The finalists, previously ecstatic, began to wonder if they had made a mistake. Juliet deleted her posts about the award. One of them posted, "Who would have thought the bet became history?" But Ellie, despite the digital euphoria surrounding her, remained silent. It was then that she revealed, "Yes, I knew everything. I knew about the bet. I knew about the fake ticket. I knew about the whispers, the looks, the waiters instructed to ignore her. She had heard it all, not because they wanted her to, but because the world of those who think themselves superior forgets that those below also have ears." In a brief interview pressed by a reporter at the gate of the new headquarters, Ellie simply said, "I knew. But those who give up their dignity to try to fit into places too small for them lose twice." The words went viral. More than that, they made an impact. And without needing to expose anyone, Ellie won the game everyone thought she had lost. She won with the most dangerous weapon one can use against arrogance: composure. That same night, Mason Carter lay awake in his Upper East Side penthouse, his eyes fixed on the only thing trembling in his hands, the copy of Ellie's application. He reread it all. Every line was carefully written, every sentence marked with genuine emotion. There was no varnish there. There was raw truth. And between the words, something pierced him from within, an old feeling he had buried for more than 2 decades. He stood, walked over to the safe built into the office wall, and pulled out an aged folder. Inside were yellowed papers, black and white photos, and old newspaper clippings. In the center, a single image, a young woman with a sweet smile holding a baby wrapped in makeshift cloths at the door of an Austin community shelter. On the back, the date, April 25th, 1997, and 2 words written in pen, Eleanor, Hope. The impact was brutal. The name, the face, the project, the look. Everything made sense now. Ellie wasn't a stranger. She was the daughter of Clara James, the only woman in Mason's entire youth who had loved him without expecting anything in return. A volunteer from Texas who worked in nursing homes and libraries when he, still a troubled and arrogant teenager, was sent to do community service as punishment for a juvenile offense. Clara had taught him to read to the elderly. She had forced him to listen to stories about people everyone ignored, and it was there in that simple shelter that Mason had learned the value of listening in silence. But he had also abandoned her. He had disappeared when he inherited his father's fortune and moved to California to launch his first startup. He never returned. Years later, he learned that Clara had died of cancer, leaving behind a young daughter. He never looked for her. Out of fear, out of guilt, out of pride. Now she was there. Ellie was Clara's daughter, and even without knowing it, she had reconnected Mason with his lost humanity. His chest heaving, Mason reread the note Ellie had left in the foundation folder. Those who transform with love need not be reminded. The transformation speaks for itself. He felt his eyes sting, perhaps for the first time in decades. The penny had finally dropped. It wasn't just charity. It wasn't just recognition. It was redemption. The next morning, Mason tried to find her, but the Foundation's headquarters were closed to the public that day. Only boxes and books were being organized. He tried calling. No answer. He sent flowers. They were returned. Ellie had disappeared from the media again, and even with all the tools and money to track anyone, Mason felt powerless. And it was in this emptiness that he understood the real price of ignoring the past. Sometimes, when you finally wake up, the soul you needed is no longer in sight. Ellie disappeared like someone who refuses to live in the noise of the farce. You didn't post anything. He didn't give interviews. He didn't respond to invitations from major publishers, to documentary proposals, to emails from sponsors who now suddenly believed in the project. The headquarters of the new living library operated, but silently. Books arrived, children filled the hallways, the elderly laughed loudly on reading mornings, but Ellie was nowhere to be seen. She hid, as if she knew the world's attention was a treacherous beacon, and that to grow deep roots one must first be invisible. Mason, for her part, became increasingly restless. She began to visit the Foundation discreetly, chatting with the coordinators, observing the project's impact from afar. Every painted wall, every organized shelf, every new child welcomed. Everything seemed to bear her name, even when she wasn't there. One afternoon, he found a sheet of paper left on a table in Ellie's handwriting. "If you want to find me, first learn to lose control." He smiled bitterly. The void in his life, so long filled with power, was now shaped exactly like a woman who didn't want applause, and who had given him back his own story without asking for anything in return. Mason searched nursing, homes, libraries, even small bookstores in forgotten neighborhoods. Everyone knew who she was. No one knew where she was. Some said they'd seen her helping an elderly man cross the street. Others said she'd traveled to care for homeless children in rural areas. Nothing confirmed, just traces, like a kindly shadow that appeared and disappeared before anyone could capture her image. Her absence began to weigh more heavily on him than anyone else's presence. He began declining invitations to events, abandoning meetings that seemed empty, and regarding his own business with a previously absent unease. It was one grey morning, sitting alone in the glass-enclosed room of his penthouse, that he finally understood. Ellie hadn't disappeared. He was finally seeing with the right eyes, and wherever she was, her presence echoed in everything. In the way the Foundation's employees began to treat one another, in the attention to detail, in the purity of their intentions. It was the first time Mason Carter had missed someone without knowing why. Not the image, but the peace it held, the quiet steadfastness, the kind of greatness that never needs to be raised. And in that disconcerting silence, he discovered what many millionaires never discover, that there are people who cannot be bought not because of pride, but because they already have everything that money cannot buy. Ellie's absence paradoxically became the center of all conversations. Influencers tried to speculate about her origins, newspapers tried to force narratives, and behavioral experts said her strategic disappearance was a masterstroke. But it wasn't. It was simply coherent, and this further confused those who make a living from spectacle. Meanwhile, Mason Carter became the target of an unprecedented media storm. His gesture of handing over the headquarters of the former Carter Foundation to a previously unknown young woman sparked suspicion among board members, investors, and even ethics committee. Members of the companies linked to his name. A group of shareholders opened an internal investigation to investigate misuse of corporate assets for personal gain. The scandal he thought he had resolved 3 years earlier, the one involving fraudulent donations, resurfaced with a vengeance. The headlines screamed, "Patron or manipulator? The girl who was worth millions? Mason in ethical crisis?" Carter Foundation back in the sights of authorities. Former partners began to drift away. CEOs declined dinners. Advertising campaigns featuring his image were paused. Even charities that had previously honored him now issued statements urging cautious distancing. Deep down, no one knew exactly why they were judging. It was just easy. Because seeing a man who had always been at the top falter, however unfair, fed the collective hunger for a fall. And then, as always happens in these cycles of power, those who had previously flattered him were the first to throw stones. In council meetings, the tone changed. Former allies called him impulsive, unstable, and even though no one had the courage to say it outright, everyone thought he fell in love with some poor girl and threw it all away. Mason, however, didn't defend himself. He didn't respond to the accusations. He didn't attack. He just listened, like Ellie did. For the first time, he experienced firsthand what she had silently endured. For the first time, he was the outcast at his own party. And it was in this brutal but symbolic social reckoning that Mason understood the value of what he had done. Because now he saw the foundation wasn't a corporate trophy, it was a seed, and though the winds were strong, that seed was already taking root in people he would never meet, but whom Ellie had touched. And of all the possible losses, the one that hurt the most was not having anyone to share this discovery with. The public downfall didn't destroy Mason Carter, but it deconstructed him. As if each trial, each cruel headline, each hostile meeting had peeled away a layer of the man he pretended to be. In place of the armored executive, the inflexible investor, and the distant billionaire, there was now a man alone, profoundly confronted with what he had always avoided feeling. In the early days of the crisis, he tried to react as always, with control. He called in lawyers, had contracts reviewed, and commissioned image management strategies. But it all sounded too false, sterile, as if his own voice had lost authority over the words he spoke. So he stopped. He cancelled the meetings. He took a leave of absence from the board. He traveled alone to Texas, and for the first time in years, he returned to the place where it all began. The city was different, drier, more forgotten, but the municipal library still existed, now smaller, with fewer funds, but with its doors open. He entered without revealing his identity. He sat in a corner and listened to a girl read a poem to a group of seniors. It was a project called Readers of Silence. There, Mason discovered that Ellie had stopped by a few months earlier. No one knew where she went afterward, but she left behind a box of books, a letter to the principal, and a sentence written in blue paint on one of the walls. A just world doesn't begin with justice. It begins with listening. From that moment on, Mason began to change. But not as a man trying to redeem himself, but as someone who finally understood that redemption is priceless and unhurried. He returned to New York without the spotlight. He discreetly visited other institutions where Ellie had left her mark, a non-profit for abused girls in Brooklyn, a night shelter in Chicago, a rural school in Vermont. Never in the spotlight, never with a speech. He began investing in grassroots projects, Not with million-dollar checks, but with presence. He sat, listened, learned. He asked for his name to be removed from plaques. He refused awards. He refused interviews. In a cafe he wrote on a napkin that he would keep with him for months. It's not about how much we give. It's about how much we don't want in return. His face disappeared from business magazines, but began to appear discreetly in impact reports of real projects. Children returned to school. The elderly smiled again. Families dreamed again. And all this without knowing that the man responsible was a man who was once hated for silently loving a woman no one dared understand. And that was what transformed him. Her absence had become the blueprint for his transformation, and even without promising anything, Ellie had done for him what not even the purest money in the world could buy. She taught him to love the invisible. The reunion happened as silently as everything that truly matters. There was no background music, no hidden cameras, no dazzled witnesses, just the sound of pages turning, children laughing in the distance, and a gentle breeze moving through the glass-enclosed room of the Living Library's new headquarters. It was an ordinary afternoon. Mason had returned to the foundation to drop off a shipment of books donated by small publishers. He wore jeans, sneakers, and a worn shirt, his new armor against the past. He was walking between the shelves chatting with a staff member when he stopped in front of a half-open door. Inside, sitting on the floor with 3 children around her, was Ellie. She quietly read an Oscar Wilde story while a girl with braids leaned against her shoulder and a boy dozed on her lap. She smiled sweetly. Her hair was tied up messily, her blouse had a small stain of blue paint, and her feet were bare. Mason couldn't move. He stood there for seconds that felt like hours, as if all the lost time was suspended in the breath he was trying to control. Ellie looked up and saw him. She wasn't startled. She didn't even smile. She just looked at him with the same serenity as always, as if she'd already known this moment was coming. As if no time had passed. He walked slowly to the door, took off his shoes, sat on the floor next to the group and simply said, "This story has one of the most unfair endings I have ever read." Ellie replied without looking directly at him, "It only seems unfair when you read it in a hurry. Some stories only make sense after you accept losing a little." The children didn't understand. They continued listening to the story. But between the 2 adults, a universe was being reorganized. Mason didn't. "Say apologize." Ellie didn't demand an explanation. Because there was no longer any debt between them, there was a learning curve. He held out a small, crumpled sheet of paper he'd been carrying for weeks. She opened it. She recognized her own handwriting. It was the note she'd left on the first day she received the key. "It doesn't matter if no one applauds. You've already won." Ellie's eyes filled with tears for the first time since it all began. Not from pain, but from relief. Because there, in that room filled with books and hope, the cycle was closing. And something new was born. Not as a romantic promise, but as a silent recognition of 2 souls who found each other for justice and stayed for purpose. Ellie's decision didn't come with speeches or tears. It came with the calm weight of someone who knows that forgiveness isn't a concession, it's freedom. After their reunion, Mason began showing up once a week at the foundation, not as a patron, but as a volunteer. He cleaned shelves, carried boxes, and helped in the workshops. The children began calling him Mr. M, an affectionate nickname he never dared to correct. He gratefully accepted every small gesture that brought him closer to the simplicity he had forgotten. Ellie watched, not with suspicion, but with the caution of someone who has learned that the greatest pain comes from where we least expect it. She saw his effort, saw his silence transformed into presence. She saw how he didn't try to justify himself, didn't demand credit, didn't seek forced reparations. He was simply there, whole, available, genuine. One autumn afternoon they were alone, sorting boxes in the back room. Dust danced in the golden light streaming through the window. He approached slowly and said, his voice almost cracking, "If I could go back in time, I would have stayed. I would have looked for you. I would have done everything differently." Ellie smiled, her eyes downcast, straightening the stacked books. "If you had done it differently, maybe I wouldn't be here now. Or you. Or any of this." Mason tried to hide the tremor in his hands. What if I wanted to stay from now on? Silence stretched like a breeze between them. Then Ellie turned, walked to the window, and stood there looking out at the gently swaying trees. "You've always had the key, Mason," she said without looking back. "But what I needed to see was if you could learn to use it without destroying the door." He understood. Not as a romantic response, but as permission. She forgave him. Not because time had healed, but because she had chosen not to carry the burden that wasn't hers. That night, he didn't take her to dinner. He didn't invite her to talk. He simply left the foundation in silence, and before closing the gate, he looked back. Ellie was sitting on the ground with a book on her lap, surrounded by children. She didn't wave, she didn't smile, but her presence was peaceful, and in that moment, he knew. She had forgiven him. But she wouldn't give herself to him, not like before, because some wounds heal with love, and so. But freedom is the final bandage. The sun was beginning to rise over Manhattan, tinging the tall, silent buildings with gold. The city, still asleep, pulsed with a slow rhythm, as if taking a deep breath before the new day. In the plaza in front of the living library, an old wooden bench sheltered a solitary figure. Mason Carter, in a dark coat and tired eyes, watched the comings and goings of ordinary people. Mothers with strollers, young people in a hurry, old men dragging bags. In her hands a small folded piece of paper. That same note, already crumpled and worn with age, in Ellie's handwriting, "You already won." He opened it one last time. He looked at it, and then he put it in the inside pocket of his coat, as if it were a relic. A few meters away, on the other side of the square, Ellie walked. A group of children followed her, running, laughing, tripping over their own backpacks. She wore a simple dress, her hair tied up messily, and carried a basket of books. At one point she stopped. One of the children fell to the ground and began to cry. Ellie knelt down, hugged him tightly, brushed the boy's knee, and gently lifted him up. Mason watched. He didn't try to approach. He didn't wave. He didn't call out. He just stood there, motionless, like someone contemplating a work of art that no longer belongs to them. Ellie then looked up and saw him. For a second, they stared at each other. She didn't smile. Neither did he. But their look said it all. There is love that no longer needs touch to exist. She turned slowly, took the child's hand, and walked forward with the group. Her steps were firm. The wind blew the light fabric of her dress. And there on the park bench, Mason remained. Not like a man waiting for someone, but like someone who had learned to wait without wanting to possess. A dry leaf fell into his lap. He picked it up and studied it calmly. Then he smiled, slightly, not with his lips but with his eyes, and he stood there as the day finally dawned, his chest light and his heart still. Because in the end, poetic justice doesn't require an audience, and sometimes the greatest victory is learning to love in silence. If you've made it this far, it's because this story touched something deep inside you. So tell me in the comments, would you forgive like Ellie did, or would you go another way? I really want to read your opinion. Take advantage and leave a like. It really helps this kind of story reach more people who also need to feel this soul-shaking shift. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos with endings that make your heart tremble in silence. And now, here's a video you're going to love, full of twists and turns, emotion, and that taste of justice that real life rarely delivers. Click here and come with me. You won't regret it.